This video is sponsored by Skillshare. If you've been following along with my Kill Team Conversion series, then you will be aware that the 9 members built so far were all rank and file Primaris. But in my effort to build out a complete roster of 20, I decided that I needed a commander. With the Raptors being a pragmatic, no-nonsense kind of people, it made complete sense that I would choose a chaplain to lead them. But with the power of kitbashing, I hope to have this traditionally ostentatious looking commander fitting in with the rest of my team. I'm Pete the Wargamer, and in this video I'll be showing you how to build a chaplain of the Raptors. Phobos armor seemed like the best place to start. Being used by the more tactically styled Vanguard units, it would immediately help the chaplain to better fit in among his compatriots. However, to give him a little more stature and to help position him as the kill team's commander, I opted for a cloak-wearing eliminator. Particularly the monopose variant found within the star-collecting Vanguard Space Marines kit. Cloaks are quite traditionally used in 40k to denote higher ranking of individuals, so it immediately helps to set him apart from some of the other members, whilst also being a functional piece of equipment, making it perfect for the Raptors too. So, I began by removing all the parts required to build the Eliminator's body from the sprue, and cleaned up some of the mold lines and sprue tabs. The Crozius Arcanum is the chaplain's symbol of office. It is essentially a glorified power mace, complete with winged iconography and plated in gold, all of which was going to be a bit much for a squad that is tasked with performing surgical strikes deep behind enemy lines. A compromise was needed. I had to find something that would feasibly match the stat line of a Crozius Arcanum whilst also being in line with the chapter's utilitarian sensibilities. I ultimately settled on a power hammer arm, taken from the Assault Intercessor kit. Both are blunt force weapons, and I could easily imagine the humble hammer being something the Raptors could put to good use beyond just smashing heretics. To attach this new arm to the Eliminator torso would require some work, however. The torso already came with part of the left arm attached. This was removed with my clippers and then trimmed back to create a flat surface, perfect for gluing. I temporarily assembled the torso once again and brought in the hammer arm to check how everything was lining up. The position of the hammer arm was good and didn't conflict with the legs either, so it didn't require any adjustments in itself. But that wasn't to say that the shoulder pad wouldn't cause some trouble. To continue the Phobos theme, I grabbed a shoulder pad from the Reaver kit and did a dry fitting against the arm and torso. While the arm on its own fit nicely against the torso, the introduction of a shoulder pad showed me that the cloak on the left side of the model was just a little bit too low. To resolve this, I made a series of trims to the underside of the cloak, which helped to widen out the area. Additionally, I also carefully removed a small section of the shoulder pad's trim. As this would be tucked beneath the cloak, it didn't matter if this was removed and would help to improve the fit. Luckily, I spotted this before I did any gluing, which made the required adjustments much easier to perform. As such, I'd highly recommend doing dry runs of your conversions, just to make sure that everything fits together before you make anything permanent. Chaplains carry the Absolver bolt pistol, which is a slightly beefier version of the standard bolt pistol. Unfortunately, getting my hands on one of these would require chopping up an actual chaplain kit. This is also necessary though, when the heavy bolt pistols carried by the Assault Intercessors were not too far off the size and shape. When I compared one of the pistol carrying arms against the Eliminator torso, I could see that the whole upper arm would need to be first removed. I began by sawing through the arm just above the elbow plate before cleaning up the cut with my knife. With the lower arm liberated, I could get a better idea of how it would line up against the torso. The small tab protruding from the upper arm was the first to be removed. I compared again and saw that a few more cuts would be needed to get a good fit. Doing a thing like this incrementally might be a little more time consuming, but it prevents you from accidentally cutting away too much and ruining a piece. I continued this process until I was happy with how the lower arm was fitting against the upper. By this stage, I had one last adjustment to make before I could bring in the glue, and that was to the chest. As the Eliminator would have originally held his sniper rifle in front of the torso, the strap would have appeared to have been connected to it, but because I had switched out this rifle for a pistol, the strap now led to nowhere. To resolve this, I made a few adjustments with my knife to soften out the edges of the strap and to help blend them into the cloak that sat next to it. With all of the adjustments to the pieces completed, I could now begin assembling some of the items together. I began by constructing the torso and the legs first. This was followed up with the attachment of the hammer carrying arm along with the Reaver shoulder pad and finally the pistol arm. Making changes to pieces before you assemble them is usually much easier to do, so always keep that in mind when planning out your conversions. Another key feature of Chaplains are their skull helmets. Being such an iconic aspect of them, this was something that I was eager to reproduce, and I had a few options to choose from. Some of the plastic Chaplain kits had some heads that I could use, and the third-party bits market also had a wide variety to choose from. But I instead chose to maintain the Phobos armor theme and modify a Reaver helmet. These already had the skeletal lower half of the face, so were a good starting point. But before I began my adjustments, I first needed to create a better way of holding the part as I worked on it. I began by drilling a 1mm wide hole into the base of the neck. Into this, I superglued a length of 1mm thick florist wire. I clipped it to length and then bent it around the bottom to create a simple handle. The top of the Reaver's helmet was quite rounded out, and so it didn't look like the forehead of a skull. I would need to build this out with some green stuff, but first I needed to create some room. So I used my knife to trim back the top of the helmet. I cut back the forehead and smoothed out the slight lip above the eyes, but maintained the vent at the top of the helmet and the lower half of the helmet. To sculpt a more skeletal looking forehead, I chose to use some green stuff. I cut and mixed up a small amount and rolled it into a small ball. This was placed onto the forehead and smoothed out around the sides of the head so that it blended into the helmet. I used plenty of Vaseline on my sculpting tool here as it prevented the green stuff from sticking, making it much easier to work with. At this point, I had the rough shape of the skull, but I wanted the features to be much more defined and striking. So I pressed the tool into each side of the forehead to create temples. This left me with 3 defined facets, one on each side of the head and the forehead itself. With this done, I then very lightly pressed the green stuff that was just above the eyes, which pushed the putty down over the eyes themselves. When I lifted these overhanging bits of green stuff, they helped to create a defined brow. Once I was happy with how the sculpting turned out, I left the green stuff to cure overnight, which left me with this skeletal looking helmet. I opted to keep the wire in place as I had planned to paint the head separately, and this would make it much easier to hold. Similarly, to make painting the cloak easier, I opted to not attach the backpack either, and instead use the same drilling and pinning technique that I'd used on the head. You'll notice that I chose not to use the regular Eliminator pack here, and instead opted for one of the Infiltrator ones instead, thus keeping the Chaplain in line with the rest of the kill team. Of course, this Chaplain couldn't be a true member of my Raptors kill team if he didn't feature some handy storage bits. Like before, I chose my pouches from a range of different Primaris kits. Some pouches were cut up and trimmed to make attaching them easier, but it's really up to personal preference of which pouches and in what quantities they are used. Up until this point, my Chaplain was much like the rest of my kill team, lacking any adornments or trinkets that didn't serve to further the mission. However, being a Chaplain, I felt that he needed something to stand out from among his squad mates, even if it was quite small compared to the other chapter's ecclesiarchy. So I took a small book and relic from the Intercessor sprue and attached them to the belt, which completed the model. All that needed to be done then was to paint and base. But before we look at the finished Chaplain, here's a little bit about Skillshare, the sponsors of this video. Skillshare is an online learning platform that offers you a whole bunch, thousands in fact, of classes that cover a vast range of topics, from illustration, design, photography and video, to marketing, business analytics and leadership. When I'm not making YouTube videos, I work as a software developer by day, and both myself and my colleagues have found the courses offered in web development to be a great help. The JavaScript Toolkit by Chris Hallman is full of useful tips that are presented in an enjoyable format. It has been invaluable in helping me to brush up on my web development skills and keeping me up to date with the latest practices and technologies. Everything is done at your own pace. There is no pressure to complete classes within a set time frame. There are no ads to interrupt your learning, and there are new classes being launched all the time. It's a great way to learn a new skill or just to fill up some time. All this is available for $10 a month when bought as an annual subscription, but the first 1,000 to click in the link in the description will get a free trial of Skillshare Premium membership. And here we have the completed Chaplain, painted in the same colours as the rest of the kill team. I opted to keep the palette just as subdued and use the same black and steel coloration over the small trinkets rather than the more traditional gold. Additionally, I also chose to paint the skull helmet in a very dark grey instead of the usual bone. This helped to keep things a little more stealthy and also created a surprisingly foreboding appearance. With the Chaplain completed, I now have a nice round 10 members of the squad, which still leaves me with plenty of room for future conversions. If you haven't done so already, be sure to check out my previous kill team conversion and painting videos, and I'll include some links to my playlist. And with that, the final thing to say is a massive thank you to my supporters. Currently, my top supporters on Patreon are Jonathan Hurt, Stuart Smith, Berserker, Daniel Dowling, Douglas Wilson, Jake, Jeremy Kaup, Jesse Smith, Casper Strand, Lyconian Primarch, Merrick, Mr. Grimm, and Raphael Beyruthi. So, a big thank you to you guys, and if you also support me on Patreon, buy me a coffee, or you just use my affiliates links, your help is what helps to keep this channel alive. And also a big thank you to Skillshare for sponsoring this video and allowing me to make it ad-free. If you would like to help me out, then you can check out my description for all of the relevant links, and until next time, thanks for watching, and goodbye.